Everybody, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. This is the age of miracle and wonder, according to Paul Simon. Actually, I think his song Boy in the Bubble is probably at least partly ironic, and it mixes hope with a pretty hefty dose of melancholy and concern, I think. But whatever, it seems more or less generally accepted and is actually pretty hard to deny that the last few hundred years have seen an amazing expansion in humanity's ability to understand the world through science, to realize its desires through technology, and to expand the rights of individuals through the progressive questioning, of social conventions. Yet it's also been a time of the wildest irrationality and violence, with totalitarianism, genocide, and more recently consumerism on a scale that threatens the planet. So why is our enlightened age so crazy? I think the answer has a lot to do with what we've been talking about in the last several episodes. The yearning that human beings have for existential unity. And in today's episode, I'd like to explain why. Things weren't supposed to happen this way. Optimism and confidence, to the point of a conviction of the inevitability of progress, have been hallmarks of the Enlightenment mentality. The philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote an essay in 1784 called What is Enlightenment? And in it he writes that nature, quote, most tenderly cares, unquote, for the human, quote, propensity and vocation to free thinking, unquote. The process of humanity's self-liberation is recursive, like an upward spiral. Free thought, he writes, gradually works back upon the character of the people, who thereby gradually become capable of managing freedom. Finally, it affects the principles of government, which finds it to its advantage to treat men, who are now more than machines, in accordance with their dignity. Because it's an expression of nature itself, Kant writes, it's seen as inevitable, this progress. He writes, impeding the progress of enlightenment would be a crime against human nature, the proper destination of which lies precisely in this progress. So it's kind of a sunny view, right? But it would be hard to deny that humankind has progressed enormously since Kant's time, following a pattern that's not really that unlike the one that he sets out here. But it seems that alongside of this one, another pattern has been unfolding that seems in a way contrary to the Enlightenment one. A seemingly anti-rational tendency that seems to rebel against it. Some historians, the British thinker Isaiah Berlin, for example, he died in 1997, is the most prominent of these. And he and others have described this tendency as a counter-enlightenment. Berlin includes Romanticism, which we looked at earlier in this series, as part of this movement. Romanticism and other anti-rationalist movements in the 19th century, he writes, quote, inspired nationalism, imperialism, and finally, in their most violent and pathological form, fascist and totalitarian doctrines in the 20th century. You may be familiar with a more recent thinker, the Canadian-American psychologist Steven Pinker. His book, Enlightenment Now, which was published in 2018, is more than 60 years, actually, after Berlin's essay, sort of tries to bring it up to date with a list of what he sees as the most important anti-enlightenment trends of today. On top of religious faith, which he's quite disdainful of, and seems to see as purely irrational, Pinkerton adds the populist politics that have emerged in the 21st century, based, he writes, on tribalism and nostalgia. Also, generally movements that put the collective over individuals, including ideologies, he says, of the extreme right and left, nationalism, identity politics crusades, and an over-romanticized green movement, the conviction that civilization is in decline, and the distrust of science. You're probably familiar with these various sort of anti-scientific movements, or movements at least opposed to mainstream or conventional, institutional science. Anyway, for Pinker, all of these movements threaten the precious gains that humanity has won for itself through Enlightenment thinking. And I think to some extent we can probably agree with at least part of what he's saying, I think, most of us. So what's been going on? What could have caused the resistance to and anxiety about that our modern resistance to and anxiety about Enlightenment thinking that seems to have arisen from the very beginning of the Enlightenment? As Pinker notes, the benefits of the Enlightenment are obvious. It'd be hard to deny the truth of any of modernity's confidence in itself. Its attainments have been real, and they do make the future look promising. Clearly, the modern era in the West has meant the flourishing of the individual in a lot of ways, and thereby of humanity as a whole. What would a revolt against individualism have to offer? And what would even be the alternative? So, champions of the Enlightenment like Pinker seem to explain it in rather negative terms, in terms of something that's just missing. Kant, for example, sees Enlightenment as humankind's release from a state of tutelage, which he considered self-incurred in that it's due to people's laziness and lack of courage. Pinker attributes it to a natural human vulnerability, the appeal of backward ideas, due to the persistence in the human brain of cognitive patterns from earlier stages of human evolution. And he writes, "Will the Enlightenment ultimately fail because it cannot speak to primal human needs?" he asks. I think not. Recall that a vulnerability is not the same as a need. So he sees the needs that seem to arise in people for these anti-individualistic or anti-rationalistic needs as actually not being needs. They only seem to be needs, but they're really flaws, vulnerabilities. He continues, still, the appeal of regressive ideas is perennial, and the case for reason, science, humanism, and progress always has to be made. So I'm not convinced of either Kant or Pinker here. To attribute anti-rationalism to ignorance, cowardice, laziness, or any other vice, it's not to name a cause that has any substance or meaning. It's not something that you could put your hands on or oppose. It's like blaming these things on the devil, which, interestingly enough, is a very unenlightened explanation. It's not true to the principles of the Enlightenment itself. Anyway, but if it's true that human desire, however misunderstood, is always based on something real, which I think is true, then it seems likely that opposition to Enlightenment thinking, or at least the way Enlightenment thinking has been conceived, has arisen from a real human need, a need for something that our modern Western humanism has somehow missed. And so what could that be? Well, I do think Berlin is more helpful here than Pinkerton or Kant. In various places, he seems to suggest that counter-Enlightenment thinkers found that the rationalism of the time didn't accurately capture reality in its wholeness, or satisfy people's desire for cohesion, for unity, for social unity. In his essay on the counter-Enlightenment, Berlin cites as an example of figures whose thought inspired the Romantic movement, for example, the German philosopher Schelling, who lived around the turn of the 18th century. And he writes, he is the father of those anti-rationalist thinkers for whom the seamless whole of reality, in its unanalyzable flow, is misrepresented by the static spatial metaphors of mathematics and the natural sciences. But note that he's saying that this is anti-rational, but this is actually an argument that Schelling is posing. In another essay on nationalism, Berlin writes of the early French sociologist Émile Durkheim that he alone perhaps perceived that rationalistic thinking, or rationalism as it was conceived at the time, and the industrial society it gave rise to resulted in new violent ideologies that tried to make up for the social cohesion that religion, among other things, had provided. Quote, that the destruction of traditional hierarchies and orders of social life, in which men's loyalties were deeply involved, by the centralization and bureaucratic rationalization, those are his quotes actually, which industrial progress required and generated, deprived great numbers of men of social and emotional security, produced the notorious phenomena of alienation, spiritual homelessness, and growing anomie, sense of not being anybody, and needed the creation by deliberate social policy of psychological equivalents for the lost cultural, political, religious bonds which served to maintain the older order. For the majority, the vacuum was filled by the old traditional bonds, language, the soil, historical memories, real and imaginary, and by institutions or leaders functioning as incarnations of men's conceptions of themselves as a community, a Gemeinschaft, symbols and agencies which proved far more powerful than either socialists or enlightened liberals wished to believe. The idea sometimes invested with a mystical or messianic fervor of the nation as supreme authority, replacing the church or the prince or the rule of law or other sources of ultimate values, relieved the pain of the wound to group consciousness, whoever may have inflicted it. A foreign enemy, or native capitalists, or imperialist exploiters, or an artificially imposed, heartless bureaucracy. And I think he means really whoever these people took to have inflicted these things. Last time, you may remember, I talked about the erosion of religion in the West over the past 250 years or so by Enlightenment thinking. You may remember several episodes ago I talked about how parallel to this, there's also been an increasing interest in existential unity or ecstasy, these unitive states in various forms. This overcoming of the alienation that seems to accompany thinking, part of being human. So there was an increase of interest in this, in Romanticism, for example, and Transcendentalism, the paths to unity people found in Eastern philosophies, and then finally by means of modern psychology, talk therapy that Freud is really seen as initiating, mindfulness practices, and more recently, of course, therapeutically administered drugs. But a couple of things are important, I think, to note here. One is that it's quite likely, I think, that Romanticism played a role, actually, in the rise of nationalism and totalitarianism. The other, which is related to this, is that for most of the last quarter millennium since the Enlightenment, most people haven't actually sought unity in these intentional ways, like meditation or therapy. Oneness, after all, is something that most of us are seeking unconsciously. It's an unconscious craving that affects a lot of things in our lives. We're not actually aware of it. And most people in the 19th and first half of the 20th century tried to satisfy their yearning for it through new forms of social cohesion. And you can remember, I think we talked a bit about last time, about how an unfortunate, to say the least, effect of social cohesion is that it tends to dehumanize the outgroup. You can see this shift, this new fascination with, or inclination towards new forms of social cohesion. If you look closely at the nationalism and totalitarianism of the 19th and 20th centuries. You might not be familiar with Mudras Ecksteins, but he's a really interesting Canadian historian. He wrote a book a decade or so ago called Rites of Spring, I think more like 2 decades ago, actually. The Great War and the Birth of the Modern Age. And he wrote about the way a lot of populations in countries that when the First World War was starting, a lot of people seemed to greet news of the war with a kind of fervor. He cites a German newspaper reporter's account, the evening of July 25th, 1914, in Berlin. This was after Serbia turned down Austria-Hungary's ultimatum, and it became clear that a major war was on the way. The reporter writes, "All of a sudden, before anyone is aware of its happening, a crowd has gathered. No one knows anyone else, but all are seized by one earnest emotion, war, war, and a sense of togetherness." This sense of enthusiasm and oneness at the outbreak of the war was common, as I just mentioned, in the countries that became involved in it. And then, of course, after the war, Europe saw the rise of various totalitarian movements that came to resemble, they resembled in a way secular religions, ideologies that saw themselves as a kind of conduit to absolute truth and especially social oneness. These had already been brewing, of course. They didn't come out of nowhere. In the 19th century, for example, the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin had written, "I do not want to be I want to be we." But it was after the First World War that they started to take this concrete and violent form. And here I want to talk a little bit about an amazing book by the German thinker Hannah Arendt, published in 1951, so a long time ago, called The Origins of Totalitarianism. It must have been written in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War or during. She writes, "The disturbing factor in the success of totalitarianism is," I'm skipping over certain things, "the true selflessness of its adherents. A Nazi or Bolshevik may even be willing to help in his own prosecution." She's talking about these kangaroo courts that she had heard of taking place in the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. "A Nazi or Bolshevik may even be willing to help in his own prosecution, frame his own death sentence if only his status as a member of the movement is not touched." It's disturbing to think about this dehumanization on this level. Within the organizational framework of the movement, as long as it holds together, the fanaticized members can be reached by neither experience nor argument. Identification with the movement and total conformism seem to have destroyed the very capacity for experience, even if it be as extreme as torture or the fear of death. And you may remember how we talked about these recent neurological findings and speculations about how these unitive states affect reality testing and self-awareness. The industrialization of society, the breakdown of old social structures, and the consequent sense of alienation that individuals felt, she wrote, made them vulnerable to these ideologies that promised them unity with others in their community. And I quote from her again, "The truth is that the masses grew out of the fragments of a highly atomized society whose competitive structure and concomitant loneliness of the individual had been held in check only by membership in a class. The chief characteristic of the mass man is not brutality and backwardness, but his isolation and lack of normal social relationships." And later in the same work, she writes that totalitarianism bases itself on loneliness, on the experience of not belonging to the world at all, which is among the most radical and desperate experiences of man. So we're kind of talking about existential alienation here. So alienation, social and existential. Totalitarianism, she wrote, eliminates the distance between the rulers and the ruled. Not in the sense of who wields power, of course, but in the sense that the boundaries of the ego are sort of erased here. She cites Hitler in a speech to the SA, the Sturmabteilung, the thugs or the paramilitary of the Nazi Party. In this speech, he depicts himself as a kind of secular messiah. And he says to them, all that you are through me. All that I am through you alone. So there's a blurring of identity here, an attempt to elicit a unitive state as religion had done previously. And it took humanity the Second World War and the various genocides that came with it to realize how vulnerable people are in this state to being misled. The human yearning for oneness is an almost unbelievably powerful drive, and to play with it is to play with fire. Rightly or wrongly, Arendt, and remember she was writing back in the 40s, her book was published in 51. She's often quite pessimistic. She didn't feel the world had found a solution to this sense of alienation. And she writes, what prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience, usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions, like old age, has become an ever-growing experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. And a little later she writes, organized loneliness threatens to ravage the world as we know it. On a more fundamental level, as I've said earlier in this series, alienation is not, of course, particular to any one epoch, but it's universal, and it's part of the human condition. It seems to come out. It seems sort of the other side of what it is to be a thinking being. I think it was a problem that Plato recognized, even though he might not have expressed it in these terms exactly, and one he tried to solve. And I think his solution has actually quite vast and mostly unrealized potential for our time. And I'd like to talk about that in more detail. But first, I'd like to explore what I think is at the heart of modern humanism and Enlightenment thinking, and that's what I'll be talking about next time. Anyway, thanks for watching, and hope to see you then.